Here's a fully original 4,000-word YouTube script based on your title concept. Note, the $100 million figure in your title is a dramatic/speculative framing. I've written the script to reflect this as a potential estimated value and exciting possibility, not a confirmed fact, so it stays honest and within YouTube community guidelines. Picture this: a frozen wasteland, collapsed tunnels, ground that hasn't been touched in decades. Most people would walk right past it, but Parker Schnabel isn't most people. While everyone else saw a graveyard, Parker saw something entirely different. He saw a question that nobody had bothered to finish asking. And when he finally descended into that old, forgotten Yukon mine with his crew, what came back up from the darkness wasn't just soil and rock. It was the kind of discovery that makes you stop, sit down, and completely rethink everything you thought you knew about gold in the Yukon. Stay with me, because what unfolded over the following weeks changed the entire direction of season, and possibly a lot more than that. The Yukon has always had a reputation for swallowing men's dreams whole. Fortunes have been made here, yes, but the land has taken just as many as it's given. The rivers run cold, the winters are brutal, and the earth gives up its gold only to those willing to work for it with patience, intelligence, and a tolerance for serious risk. Parker Schnabel grew up understanding all of this. He didn't come from the outside world, starry-eyed and full of romantic ideas about gold mining. He came from a family that had been doing this for generations, and from the time he was old enough to sit in a mining machine, he was learning. That background matters enormously when you're trying to understand why Parker does things the way he does. He doesn't gamble. He calculates. And every now and then, he finds something that makes all the calculation worth it. This particular story begins not with a dramatic moment in the field, but in a much quieter place, a room full of old documents. Parker had been hearing scattered references to an old mine site for a while, not from other miners necessarily, and not from industry gossip, but from records, historical drilling reports, survey maps that dated back decades, the kind of paperwork that most people would throw in a box and forget about. But Parker had made a habit of going through this kind of material carefully, because he understood something that a lot of people in this business overlook. The past is full of unfinished business, and unfinished business, in mining, sometimes means opportunity. What he found in those old records was genuinely puzzling. The mine had been active at some point clearly. There were logs of drilling activity, notes about excavation directions, records of tunnels being started. But the pattern was strange. Some drilling lines simply stopped without explanation. Tunnels had been begun and then abandoned midway. There were areas on the maps that should logically have been explored, given the surrounding activity, but there was no record of anyone ever going there. It was as if the entire operation had been moving in a specific direction, and then, at some point, everything just stopped. No gradual wind down, no methodical completion of remaining work, just a halt. Parker read through these documents multiple times, and the same thought kept surfacing. These people didn't leave because they were finished. They left because something forced them to stop before they were done. That distinction is critical. There's a world of difference between a mine that's been exhausted and a mine that's been abandoned. An exhausted mine has been worked until there's nothing left worth taking. An abandoned mine is a mine where the people doing the working ran out of time, money, technology, or willpower before the ground ran out of gold. One is genuinely empty. The other is something else entirely. And as Parker read through the history of this site, it became increasingly clear to him that this was the second kind. Of course, knowing that in theory and proving it in practice are two completely different challenges. Parker gathered his team and laid out what he was thinking. He didn't oversell it. He was honest about the uncertainties, honest about the risks, and honest about what they didn't know. The reaction from the team was mixed. Some members were genuinely intrigued. Others were skeptical in the way that experienced people tend to be skeptical, not because they couldn't see the logic, but because they'd seen how often promising theories dissolved into disappointing reality once boots hit the ground. A few were outright hesitant. Old mines are dangerous. That's not a figure of speech or an exaggeration. Structural instability, water accumulation, inadequate air circulation, unpredictable ground movement. These are real hazards that have injured and killed people in this industry. Walking into an abandoned mine without proper preparation isn't adventurous. It's foolish. Parker made it clear from the start that foolishness wasn't the plan. Before anyone went underground, before any machines were deployed, there would be a thorough surface-level assessment. Every visible feature of the site would be examined and documented. Old entry points would be evaluated from the outside before anyone considered going through them. The structural condition of accessible tunnel sections would be checked. Safety was not a box to tick on a checklist. It was the foundation that everything else would be built on. Only when the team had enough information to make informed decisions would they go any further. That approach, disciplined and methodical, is one of Parker's defining characteristics as an operator, and it's a significant part of why his operations tend to produce results where others fail. The initial surface survey was revealing in ways that weren't obvious at first glance. The soil across the site wasn't uniform in color or texture. In some areas, it had a distinctive yellowish-brown tone, while other sections showed darker, different-looking earth. To an untrained eye, this might look like nothing at all. To someone who understands how ground changes in response to what's beneath it, these color variations are signals. They suggest that different processes have been at work at different depths below the surface, processes that can sometimes be connected to mineral concentration. It's not conclusive evidence of anything on its own, but it's information. And in the early stages of an investigation like this, information is everything. The team also noticed something in the rock itself. Running through several exposed stone surfaces were thin whitish streaks, quartz veins. These formations are geologically significant because quartz is often found in association with the same conditions that produce gold deposits. Again, quartz veins by themselves don't guarantee anything. The Yukon has quartz veins everywhere, but combined with the anomalous soil coloring, the unfinished drilling records from the historical documents, and the unusual water flow patterns the team was observing across parts of the site, they were building what researchers and investigators in any field call a convergence of indicators. Multiple separate pieces of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. That convergence is what justifies the next step. The next step was technology. Modern ground scanning equipment has transformed what's possible in mining assessment. Where earlier generations of miners had to rely almost entirely on physical sampling and their own accumulated experience, today's teams can gather information about underground structures without digging at all. Scanning tools can reveal layer composition, identify changes in rock density, map water channels, and highlight geological features at significant depths. The data isn't perfect, and it still requires experienced interpretation, but it's vastly superior to working in the dark. Parker's team deployed these tools across the most promising areas of the site, and the results began to add detail and texture to a picture that had previously been a rough outline. What the scans revealed was interesting in several ways. The underground structure wasn't what you'd call simple. The layers weren't horizontal and uniform. There were angles to them, faults, areas where the rock composition changed in ways that suggested historical geological activity. Shifts, pressures, movements in the earth that had happened over enormous timescales and had redistributed whatever minerals might be present. This complexity was part of why the earlier miners had found the site difficult to work. Without the ability to see underground, they were navigating essentially blind, and in complex geological terrain, that means a lot of wasted effort and a high probability of missing things. The new scans were helping the team understand the actual three-dimensional shape of what they were dealing with. And the more they understood that shape, the more they began to appreciate why the historical operators had made certain decisions, and where those decisions had left gaps. Around this time, the team began collecting physical samples, core samples, soil samples, rock specimens from various locations across the site. These were sent to assay laboratories for analysis, a process that involves examining the mineral content of each sample in precise detail. The team waited. This is one of the more frustrating parts of exploration work. You gather your evidence, you do your analysis, you ship your samples, and then you wait for other people to run their tests and produce their reports. You can't rush it. The science takes the time it takes. When the initial assay results came back, the team gathered around and went through them carefully. The numbers weren't dramatic. They weren't the kind of results that make people shout and slap each other on the back. But they were significant. Mineral content in certain samples was measurably different from the background levels found in the surrounding areas. Not wildly different, not off the charts different, but clearly, distinctly, scientifically different in ways that couldn't be attributed to random variation. Parker looked at the data for a long time before saying anything. Then he said what experienced operators say when the evidence is real but incomplete. This tells us something, but not everything. It tells us enough to keep going. The decision to push deeper was made deliberately, not impulsively. The team had done their surface assessment. They had their scanning data. They had their initial assay results. They had a clearer understanding of the underground structure than anyone had possessed when the original miners walked away from this place. And they had safety protocols in place that hadn't existed decades ago. Going deeper was a calculated choice, not a leap of faith. But it was still a meaningful escalation, and everyone understood that. Deeper excavation means higher costs. It means greater complexity in terms of ground management, water control, and air quality. It means less margin for error. Everyone on the team accepted these realities and committed to proceeding carefully. The deeper excavation was methodical. Each new layer was examined as it was exposed. Samples were collected at regular intervals. The structural integrity of the surrounding ground was monitored constantly. There were moments of tension. There always are in this kind of work, when the ground behaved in ways that required a pause and a reassessment. But the work continued, and as it did, the samples being collected began to tell an increasingly interesting story. The assay results from the deeper layers weren't just slightly different from the surface readings. They were noticeably better, not spectacularly better. Parker was careful to manage expectations and resist the temptation to extrapolate too far from early data, but better in ways that were scientifically meaningful and operationally relevant. Then came the moment that changed the trajectory of everything. As the team compiled data from multiple drilling points across the site and began mapping the results onto their underground models, a pattern emerged that none of them had anticipated. The deposit, if it was a deposit in any meaningful sense, wasn't where the original miners had been focusing their attention. It wasn't in the zones that historical geological theory would have identified as most likely. It was off to the side of those zones, in areas that had received little or no attention from the previous operators. This displacement from the expected location was the key that unlocked the whole puzzle. The original miners hadn't found much not because there wasn't much to find, but because they'd been looking in the wrong direction. And they'd been looking in the wrong direction because without modern scanning technology, they had no way to see the actual underground structure clearly enough to know where to look. This is the kind of discovery that reframes an entire investigation. When you realize the target was always somewhere other than where everyone was searching, you go back and look at everything differently. The team went back through their data, their scan results, their assay reports, and started reinterpreting all of it through this new lens. And what they found, when they looked at everything together through this updated understanding, was that the signals pointing toward the actual location of the deposit were stronger and more consistent than they had initially seemed. Multiple independent data points, from soil sampling to ground scanning to water flow analysis, all converged on the same area, the area that hadn't been touched. As the confirmation drilling began in earnest, focused now on the right location rather than the expected one, the results continued to strengthen the picture. The process was still careful, still methodical, still governed by the understanding that initial signs in mining are not the same as final outcomes. Parker kept repeating this to his team. What we're seeing is encouraging. It's not a guarantee. Every piece of data is one piece of a larger puzzle, and the puzzle is still being assembled. That discipline, maintaining measured realism in the face of evidence that could easily generate irrational excitement, is one of the hardest things to do in exploration work. It's also one of the most important. But even with disciplined realism firmly in place, the weight of the accumulating evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. As more drilling results came in and the geological picture continued to fill in, the early estimates of what might be present began to shift. Initially, the team had been thinking in terms of scattered, isolated pockets of mineralization, what geologists call patchy deposits. Significant, potentially, if there were enough of them, but limited in their implications. But as the data expanded, the picture that emerged was different. The mineralization didn't look patchy and isolated. It looked connected. Different sections of the site, sections that had initially appeared to be separate, were starting to look like parts of a single, larger geological structure. The layers were speaking to each other across distances that earlier analysis hadn't been wide enough to capture. This is the point at which the word jackpot stops being a fantasy and starts being a question. Nobody was using that word aloud. Parker certainly wasn't. But the underlying arithmetic was beginning to suggest that if the patterns they were seeing held up across the full extent of the deposit, and that was a significant if, and it remained an if, the total value of what might be recoverable could be genuinely transformative. Not just for the season, not just for the operation, potentially for the entire economics of mining in this part of the Yukon. When experienced miners start doing that kind of math in their heads, carefully, responsibly, without overstating anything, and the numbers come back looking the way these numbers were coming back, the atmosphere changes. Not dramatically, not with celebrations or announcements, but the air in the camp was different. There was a quality of focus and quiet intensity that people who work in this industry recognize. It's what happens when something real is emerging from the ground. The economic modeling began in parallel with the ongoing technical work. This is not a glamorous part of mining, but it is a fundamentally important one. Finding gold is one thing. Recovering it profitably is another. You have to account for depth, because deeper gold costs more to reach. You have to account for the distribution of the mineralization, because gold spread thinly across a large volume of rock is much harder to extract economically than gold concentrated in accessible veins. You have to account for the cost of machinery, labor, permitting, processing, and transport. You have to account for gold prices, which fluctuate. And you have to account for time, because a deposit that takes 10 years to develop may look very different on a discounted cash flow basis than one that can be brought into production in 2. All of these variables were being fed into the calculations the team was running, and the outputs, while still preliminary and subject to significant revision, were telling a consistent story. The scale of potential value being discussed in those preliminary estimates was substantial enough to justify a fundamental rethinking of how this site should be approached. Parker had come into this investigation thinking of it as an exploration project, a search for answers about what had been left behind. But the evidence was moving toward a conclusion that this might warrant being treated as something much larger. A long-term, structured mining operation, not a single-season excavation, but a multi-year project with dedicated infrastructure, systematic extraction, and the kind of sustained investment that produces serious, durable returns. Making that shift from exploration mindset to development mindset is a major step. It changes the financial requirements, the regulatory obligations, the management demands, and the strategic horizon. It's not a decision to be made lightly or quickly, but it's a decision that the evidence was beginning to make increasingly logical. There was a broader implication in all of this that wasn't lost on Parker or anyone else paying attention. The Yukon has hundreds of abandoned mine sites. Some of them were abandoned for good reasons. They were genuinely exhausted, or they were structurally compromised beyond any reasonable hope of rehabilitation. But many of them were abandoned simply because the technology of their time was insufficient to fully evaluate them, or because the economics of a particular era made marginal sites impractical to develop, or because operators ran out of capital before they ran out of ground. For decades, the conventional wisdom has been that abandoned means finished, done, not worth revisiting. This investigation was beginning to challenge that assumption in a direct and data-backed way. If an old mine that had been written off entirely could come back to life with the application of modern scanning technology, modern safety practices, modern assay capabilities, and a patient